All right. Hello, everyone, to the second Thought Atlas. We have settled on the name from last time. Hello, adults, children, dreamers of all ages, if I'm doing that correctly. I don't know if you guys have any idea what I'm talking about, but today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to have about, hopefully, an hour. We're going to each bring up a couple of topics and get some fresh takes and some maybe more research takes from each other here
Oh,
and
I
just have
didn't.
fun with it. So, yeah.
Oh,
Oh, go on.
sorry.
What were you going to say?
I'm just going off the cuff. I didn't research mine much.
All right. You want to go first then?
Oh, no, no. Whatever. I can. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
My
and then
name's Sam
we've got
MC.
Eli and uh, Peter and Sam C. At the moment, if we bring up some documents, we'll get rearranged. But you'll see. You know who we are now. All right. So what do you guys got for topics today?
Red glasses man.
Well, I was thinking of talking about trans and what trans is because I am very interested in exploring topics that kind of range on that realm of like, oh, this is like contentious, but like I don't want to be contentious, but I'm very interested as to why things are contentious. And I'm very interested in exploring those things because they're contentious because there's a reason that they're contentious, right? It's kind of like two worldviews, or worldviews coming together and almost irreconcilable differences, I guess. And I'm very interested as to the aspects of viewpoints that have irreconcilable differences. And that sort of thing. So I was thinking of that because it's kind of like, it's been a hot topic for the last few years, and I'm not sure we're making too much progress in the social sphere because it's a lot of, that is almost like, blatant tribalism at this point. People are just name calling and fighting and stuff. So that's what the topic that I was thinking about. Or also like, the Hunter Biden laptop is very interesting to me because that's totally crazy.
Oh yeah, I think they're both good topics. We lost Peter for a second there, but he's back.
Yep, and we're back.
But yeah, did you catch all that, Peter? It says your microphone's muted, by the way.
I did catch all that.
All right. Well,
I think the idea of the trans topic is a perfect follow-up to our first episode. I certainly have a lot to say on the subject.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, there's a lot there, so we don't have any problem with communication. What was your topic that you were thinking of bringing up, Peter?
I brought mushrooms and the afterlife to the table. Two potentially related topics for the more hippie-minded out there. Are the mushrooms the ticket to the afterlife temporarily? Who knows? But in my mind, two distinct topics. One related to medicine, and one in the afterlife focused more on religion. And is this belief in the afterlife that's so universal across cultures, is it healthy or not?
Ooh,
So that's what I was thinking.
all right, and I decided to stick with current events. I was either going to jump on to the Biden unrealized gains tax, or the gold backing of the ruble, or the slap maybe. But that's a little bit. I think everyone's probably tired of that by now.
fluff. Yeah.
And then also some redistributive properties of like currency and how like M1 and M2 and M3 and what the Fed is doing works. That was a sort of a creation of my own, but yeah, any of that would be good.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm pretty interested in currency
So
as
then
well.
with the trans thing, so we'll start off with just something relevant, of course, in the way is so. What do you guys think of the J.K. Rowling? Is J.K. Rowling transphobic or not?
So I've looked into this a little bit. I know there was the I think there were several tweets that were deemed transphobic from J.K. Rowling. The first one, it honestly just seemed like she didn't know what she was talking about. It was kind of an okay boomer moment. The second one was a bit more concerning. I don't know. I mean, my problem with cancel culture, especially in response to a handful of tweets. Now, given I don't know how many there were or how offensive they were, I don't recall. I try to avoid Twitter, honestly. But my problem with cancel culture and canceling someone because of a handful of tweets is you're canceling a teachable moment. I mean, I like to find the teachable moment when someone says something that I think comes from a place of just not knowing, and it's not their fault that they don't know, and they have no idea that they might even really be hurting somebody's feelings. But
could anybody summarize or find or something what the content of those tweets in question? Because I don't really know.
Yeah, I was actually trying to find it as we speak.
yeah,
That's what I was doing over here. I mean, I just was trying to think of something funny or interesting to start it off with, just to get the ball rolling. Like, we don't need to center it on J.K. Rowling.
To my understanding, it was essentially like biological males shouldn't compete in women's sports. Was that what she was saying?
She is on that subject, yes. Let's see. There are no words. These are some of the tweets here. There are no words to express how shocked and devastated I am to hear of Rickman's death. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything. Oh, never mind. I have pulled up a list of her tweets, but it's apparently by the number of likes, not by
well, good luck sorting through those. We'll come back in 3 hours.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that a lot of these articles are saying she's very transphobic without linking the tweets, although I've seen some of them. Here's one. Let's see what this one says. If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. And so
but this is where it's interesting that you went to cancel culture, because I agree with you on cancel culture. I think it's totally inhumane. But the point is not necessarily the cancel culture, but what she was supposedly canceled for. And that's the issue, is there's this sense, this is why I want to bring it up, because it's so interesting to me that there's this this sense on one side. You have people that are saying oh, you can't say certain things because it'll hurt people's feelings, which I totally understand. On the other side, you have people, so these people sometimes I think are categorizing people as oh, you're just a hateful person, you hate trans people. On the other side, though, these people are seeing, basically, they're okay, there's a group of people that have sort of institutional backing, and the grace of institutions that are saying, essentially, you're not allowed to acknowledge the truth about biological sex, which is it's a scientific fact. So to these people, they're well, of course, there's some hateful people, right? There's always going to be hateful people, but I'm not talking about those hateful people. They should be kind of condemned and put to the side in all cases. But there are people that are just hey, you can't redefine the scientific, factual reality of biological sex and the differences therein because of how someone feels internally. Now, my personal thought on trans in general is a pretty libertarian view. If you want, you can live however you want. But the issue comes, I think, for me, is now you have a group of people saying, no, we define these categories this way. And now they're imposing that categorical redefinition of reality is that human beings have always acknowledged, forever, on everyone else. And to me, that's like, there's a middle ground here, but we're not like getting there because it's just like such push, it's like two sides like doing this, right? But we're kind of missing the entire crux of the whole argument, because to me, it's like the reality of biological sex is a fact, right? And we're not talking about intersex, because that's a very small portion of the population that's like legitimately, that's like a legitimate separate issue.
And what's interesting about that is that there was that had come up in a debate on Steven Crowder's podcast, where he was doing a Change My Mind, and the guy said something. He said something like, well, like this percentage of the population is, and then it was intersex, and they looked up. He had quoted a medical journal, so they pulled up the medical journal, and it said something like intersex people comprise like 0.0017% of the population, or something like absurdly tiny like that. And of course, that's when we say intersex, just for anyone listening, we're talking about people that are born with a genetic abnormality where they have either both or neither complete set of reproductive organs. So these are people that literally don't fit into like a straight binary, not people that are like, I want to be a girl now or whatever.
Yeah.
And then often what happens is the doctor and the parents will choose one set to remove and make their best guess, and sometimes the guess is not right.
So to my understanding with that, there's more often than not, it's like basically you're 80-90% one and 10-20% the, like there's one that's clear. It's hardly ever like kind of 50-50, like right in the middle.
Well, if you leave them alone, which a lot of times they don't anymore because it's not a good medical idea, one will typically develop more than the other. But like, when they're first born, that's not always clear.
One side or the other. But that is a legitimate issue, that is a separate issue from the trans issue.
As I understand it, the two issues I think right now where what people don't agree, I mean, outside of like the Republicans just being like, we're going to outright reject this, like, period. Where their objection also seems to be somewhat of a linguistic thing, where they're like, boy, girl, man, woman, male, female, they all mean the same two things, right? And so then what you have then is you have, even within the left, for example, you have the people that are trans rights activists who have this idea that you can transition from male to female and vice versa, versus gender abolitionists who say that like the concept of gender is a social construct that needs to be abolished, right? And then you have different degrees of that, where there's the ones that are saying that like, well, gender is a social role and sex is a scientific characteristic, and then others that are saying that both are a construct, and those are kind of the wacky ones where you're like, okay, well, and they probably make up a tiny percentage of that movement. And so where Rolling falls is in the she thinks that there's definitely male and female and that they mean something, although I believe she does differentiate between like a social role and a like biological role. And then the second area of contention is on whether or not trans women should be included in feminism. And where J.K. Rowling falls on this is that trans women are not biological women, and feminism is for biological women. And so including trans women dilutes the message, because it's all about women who had to deal with the biological realities of what it means to be a woman, and having like periods and children, not being able to be considered equal to men for some reason, where they have a lot to contribute and should be viewed equally. And so that's where she gets into troubles, because she's saying, well, no, I don't care about this whole, like, I don't want like biological men in my movement. I want feminism to be for biological women, and a lot of people are, well, that makes you transphobic. And she argues back, Well, no, that doesn't make me transphobic because I don't have anything against trans people. I'm just drawing a distinction. Like there should be a trans movement for trans people and a women's movement for biological women, and that's what feminism is to her, right?
Dude, real
She's
real
saying-
quick, real super quick about that. To me, that's simply like there's certain things that can be categorized by biological sex and not gender identity, which like is totally sensible to me. You know, that should be the category upon which certain things are organized. You know, and that's all she's saying, seems to me. But anyway, I want to hear what you have to say, Peter.
Yeah, I've been smiling because I feel like we're already really close to what I think is the core of this debate. And that is people's desire to put things into categories or to think in terms of a binary. So, a little background. I have a background in mental health. There's a book, and it's in a way, it's kind of the summary of all the knowledge we have about psychology and mental health. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, colloquially the DSM. It's the basis for everything we do in American psychology, right? It's the book. It says how the diagnoses work, it's based on the research, right? And by its nature, it's very categorical. I mean, you either get one diagnosis or the other, or maybe multiple, but only one or the other. But in this most recent revision of the DSM,
I've heard about this. I think. Carry on.
what's that?
I think I've heard about this. Carry on. I was just.
Excuse me.
Yeah, we're on 5. I don't think 6 is coming because we're going to switch to the European system. Last I checked. But in the back of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there's a section for diagnosing mental health and mental illness along a spectrum because very few things fit into neat categories. You know, you can be depressed but also kind of anxious, or you can be, you can have some bipolar symptoms, but not all of them. And a lot of these things occur along a spectrum. And a lot of people would say that gender also occurs along a spectrum. Now, sex is perhaps a little bit easier. There's a chemical basis, there's the X chromosome and the Y. But gender, how you choose to express yourself as a function of your biological sex, I think very much a spectrum. I mean, even before woke culture, people talked and joked and wrote a lot about manly men like Ernest Hemingway, and womanly women like Julie Andrews or Audrey Hepburn. So that is to say that we've always kind of acknowledged that gender occurred on something of a spectrum because there are very few absolutes in this life. I think we can all agree on that. So even COVID at times blurred the line between dead and alive when people's blood oxygen count dropped so low that they were medically dead and then went on to survive. So very few things fit neatly into categories. And gender is one of those things that occurs on a spectrum.
But then you would say maybe the first thing, not the only thing, because there's certainly more than one fight going on. But one of the more important fights that might need to be won if you're coming from a pro transgender perspective is the language battle, just getting people to accept the separation of gender and sex.
Right.
Because there's a lot of people that just don't get that far. They don't understand the argument even.
And I'm actually totally I think this is totally right on this this understanding about gender. But this is also basically what feminists have been saying for, at least 100 years, where like there's no such thing as a feminine, like a female mind or a female behavior. It's the same thing they've been saying.
Which is strange because you hear that from transgendered individuals saying, well, they have a female mind and this can be proven. I've never seen a
That's
research that proves it, but I've heard them claim that there's research that proves it. So I don't know. I don't have a source on that. It's just
I would
an interesting claim I've heard. What was that,
of that.
Peter? I'm sorry. Remember, when I talk, you guys get cut off. So repeat yourself, Peter first, and then Sam second.
Skeptical. I do know that there's no research that says that males are better at math. So I'm doubtful that there's any research to show like really significant, meaningful differences between a male and a female brain. Perhaps some things related to child rearing and childbirth, based on hormone levels, but I wouldn't imagine there's much more than that. Otherwise, a lot of our research and knowledge about the brain would go out the window, and we'd a lot of people would be getting pretty messed up when they went into neurosurgery.
Well, what's really interesting about that sort of tendencies of biological males versus biological females, apparently there's pretty. I mean, I haven't done the research, but I heard Jordan Peterson talk about it, and he said basically like there's lots of research that there's certain tendencies that are more prevalent in certain sexes. That's not to say that they don't evenly, or maybe not evenly, but they don't distribute across sexes also, So for instance, like aggression, he talks about like that basically on the whole average, men are maybe slightly, but not much more aggressive personality wise than females. However, when you get to the top like 10% of most aggressive, it's like almost all males, So it's like all the traits are basically like that. It's like they're spread across. However, there are certain, I don't know how to say it. He's much more better at explaining it, but there is a difference. However, to me, that doesn't even matter to me really, because you can't make any judgments on that because it's still statistically like basically almost 50-50, Yeah. Like, for instance, myself, like I have a lot of classically would be feminine characteristics. Like I'm very intuitive. I'm artistic, emotional minded. So like I feel like it's no surprise to me that basically the mind and characteristics of personality and consciousness and everything are totally kind of like spread out between classically masculine and classically feminine polarities, amongst all people. But as to what that actually means, like, okay, what does gender identity mean? Like I wouldn't have any problem with what your take on it, Peter. But what I see is that people taking, okay, yeah, gender identity is totally fluid and doesn't match sex. But then people take that and they say, oh, so I'm actually a female now in my gender identity. But then they say, okay, now my sex is categorized as female, Not, maybe they won't say that, but that's what they imply, because when people try to push back where certain, people are saying certain avenues of human interaction should be organized not by gender, but by biological sex for different reasons. But then people push back on that, trans activists, and say, oh, no, you're transphobic now because you're not allowing me, who is female by gender, but they're talking past each other because one is trying to categorize on the basis of biological sex for certain reasons that make sense, and other people are trying to organize on gender identity, but they're using the same words, so they're getting confused.
One of the areas I think where you probably could find research is you probably, because of like bone structure and things like that, you could probably find a way that you could like be handed a brain in an autopsy and tell you what kind of body it came out of.
Oh,
But
there's that.
I don't think there's any proof that that would have a significant impact on your personality. And even if you did, it wouldn't mean that you could be born. If that does exist, would mean that it didn't matter how trans you are. If you're in a male, like a physically, like, you know, XY male body, like you could be trans all you want and your brain's going to get pulled out, and they'd be able to tell that it came from a male body, if that sort of thing exists at all. So I don't know that it supports that argument, even if they could find a study that says that, well, you can tell them apart. Well, it's like you can tell them apart based on their sex, not based on their gender identity, you know?
Right.
I mean,
But
like,
I mean, I don't know who at this point is claiming that sex and gender identity have to match up. Like who's claiming now that like if you're a male, you have to be like more aggressive, more logical,
Well,
better at math.
there's certainly like
You know,
right wing
I mean,
like paleocons that claim that.
yeah.
yeah, some people, but I mean, I don't think those are like. That's the thing. I think we're taking the like extremist voices on all the thing in that, you know, on all the sides, and then categorizing like each side by those. Where I think we can just kind of push aside all the extremists and like kind of get to the heart of like what's really going on, and that's what's interesting to me. You know, like I don't think it's acceptable at all for someone to say like, oh, because you're biologically male, you have these, you know, like internal characteristics. Like I thought we were past that. You know.
Right.
Yeah, and the thing is people used to just like kind of, in my opinion anyway, just sort of like live their lives as they wanted to, in a sense, where like you had your Wendy the Welder and like tomboy type stuff, and no one really like worried about like classifying the gender and changing pronouns. Like they were just who they were. And so I think it is fascinating, and kind of like what Peter was talking about, where people are like really driven to try to like categorize and then like stick into categories, whether it's like in a negative sense on the right, where they're like no, you're just a woman, period, I don't care how like, what you transition to. And then but also within like the left as well, with the trans community being like, no, I need to have specific pronouns to be referred to a certain way. And it's just like, and to me that's always sort of struck me as like, why would you want the false adulation? like wouldn't you want to be naturally viewed as a woman, because that's like what you're trying to do? But I guess I can also understand where someone might become frustrated because they have been dealt certain characteristics that you can't just hand wave away. But then interestingly, earlier in the week, another event related to the subject that happened was there's a Twitch streamer by the name of Destiny, and a lot of people like insisted, oh, you should check out Destiny. But the problem is I don't really watch Twitch streaming, and they don't really do a lot of YouTube stuff other than uploading streams, and then you got like a 7-hour video, and I'm just like, I'm not gonna sit here and watch 7 hours. But they were banned from Twitch for, from what I understand, essentially saying that if female sports keep being dominated by like physiological men, eventually there's going to be like a popular outcry because most people just don't understand these things. And so they weren't saying that men aren't, or trans men aren't real men, or trans women aren't real women. He was just pointing out sort of like the like sociology of the public, and he got banned even for that. And that's where when I was saying like we should stream, maybe not on Twitch though. Like this whole thing would just get us like booted on day one.
And this is our first Twitch stream.
No, we're not. No, we're not streaming today. I'm just saying, like, they're just, yeah, but they're like just discussing it in any, like, even to raise a question is not allowed now on Twitch, and you're like, man, that's rough.
Yeah, forget Twitch.
Yeah, but this is the problem. This is why I'm saying people are confused as to the categories of biological sex versus gender identity, because literally what he's saying is 100% factual. There are differences biologically between men and women. That's a fact. I mean, that's a scientific fact. No matter how anyone feels, doesn't change that scientific fact, you know?
The two
now,
things...
person and say, like, you are this, you know, or anything like that. But there's certain... You have to acknowledge reality. And there's a reason why there were women's sports and men's sports to begin with, you know? Because there's no competition in certain aspects, certain sports, strength-based sports, certain sports.
And even
there's
and even in those sports, there's different categories a lot of the time for like weight class or whatever, even among men or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and full self-disclosure, I think sports are dumb and people get what they deserve, but yes, there are physical differences between men and women, especially at young ages. I mean, boys will have more testosterone so they can extract higher muscle performance, whereas girls tend to be 2 or 3 years ahead of boys in terms of social and sort of social intelligence and social maturity.
All
Yeah.
right.
So,
So whose
uh,
topic was this one
Yeah,
anyway? I forget.
doesn't matter. Yeah, I think it was Sam's, but yeah, there are differences. And do people have a right to a fair competition in their stupid sports? Yes, especially because there's a lot of money and scholarships involved.
well, it's not. I mean, for some people, they live for those. I mean, you train. So this is a situation where like I don't give a shit about sports either. Like I literally don't care at all. However, that's some people's lives, and some
Right.
people train and like so. I can't say to someone like, "Oh, your sport is stupid." Like, why do you care? Because some people literally that is their life. They love that sport. They train their whole life, right? And
Right.
now
Right.
because someone decides or not decides whatever, but where our miscategorization or our misunderstanding of the situation is now basically wrecking certain people's lives because we can't sort out like there's a reason why biological men and biological women don't compete in certain sports. And we can't just throw that out the window because we want to make people feel better or these people are suffering or what have you to be politically correct or woke or whatever. Like we need to acknowledge reality, and that's the problem is we're not. And like Twitch, it proves if someone even what he said is true. And now there's this like, nope, cut it off, cut it off, cut it off. There's only one perspective that's that's allowed to be talked about, and it's not even real. It's not a true perspective because they're not acknowledging the reality of the differences of biological sex. And so that's why I'm like, it's kind of wild, man. Like it's a weird situation that we're in.
Yeah, and I don't, I mean, yeah, as much as I said, I think sports are dumb. I totally agree with you, Sam, that for some people this is their life and this is their career. I mean, try telling Tiger Woods that golf is dumb and the rules are
Right.
made up. And it's just a bunch of Scottish people hitting rocks with sticks. Um,
Go to your home. Are you
yeah.
too good for your home?
Go on, lassie. Whoosh. Yeah.
Well, like,
But
oh, go on.
I don't know what the resolution is to trans participation in sports. I mean, I would take it to a biological level and say, unless the athletes are chemically equal, it's not a fair competition because it isn't. And I don't really like that. I'm not entirely comfortable with that resolution either, because somebody's going to be disappointed and be heartbroken. Uh, but I don't know how else to resolve that situation,
Well,
that debate.
two
Right.
interesting things there is one, if you put like if you said, well, you have to just make a new league for like trans athletes. I wonder. I'm pretty sure my prediction would be that the trans men and trans women would be upset about, or at least the trans men would be upset about having to compete against the trans women. And then the other thing I would say is like if you have, because there are leagues for example, like disabled teenagers, kind of like how there's the Paralympics, right? And if some guy that was like a professional like athlete, like professional football player, wanted to participate in the trans teenager group, like I would say that's silly. I wouldn't be called ageist and I wouldn't be called ableist,
Exactly.
But if I question it at all when it comes to like trans men or trans women, all of a sudden you're like a transphobe, and I'm just like, okay, guys, like we have to at least be able to talk about this stuff. You can't just like end the conversation. Although for time we might need to end the conversation and move on to another subject.
I don't want to hog it. It's fascinating to me.
Does anyone have any pressing final thoughts that they want to get out there before we move on? I'm sure we'll be back because there's a whole bunch of trans arguments besides whether or not they're valid or the sports thing. Like we didn't even touch on the rights of parents and children and puberty blockers and trans story time and sexual education. So we'll be back. This isn't going to be the last one.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I would just end by saying that I do try to be trans affirming, and that I still don't know what the resolution is to the sports debate, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think I would just say that the sports thing is an easy to imagine or conceptualize aspect of this, but the biological sex thing versus gender identity dilemma, there's probably other situations where that would come into play also, but sports is like an easy one to think about, but yeah, there's a lot of it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah. So Peter, what do you got for us?
Well, let's talk about either the afterlife or mushrooms, because in the question I wanted to answer,
I guess, is the
I thought you were connecting them together.
No, there's a connection unless you want there to be, man. But two separate topics, and kind of a central question to each one. So for the afterlife question, is the belief in the afterlife healthy or unhealthy? And the question for mushrooms, what is good medicine and what is bad medicine? Because we're in a world where OxyContin was legal, super easy to get, and mushrooms and LSD, super illegal, very difficult to get in an official setting.
Yeah.
So what's good medicine? What's bad medicine?
Well, I do know they've been rolling back some of the restrictions on studying LSD, which is
years later.
Like for the history for people that don't know is that LSD was more or less it wasn't exactly discovered, but it was beginning to enter like study right when they were doing the first round of like major drug war stuff, and it was like immediately banned, even though like almost none of the studies were completed on it. So there's been a long time, even from just like not even from people that are like, yeah man, I just like it grows out of the ground, man, like not from those people, like from actual like academic researchers that are like, no, you guys have like put an arbitrary restriction on the study of the substance that might actually have real medical benefits.
Right, and the banning of LSD was one of the first salvos in the drug war. I think Nixon started that, as part of the culture wars. And there were really promising studies going on. There are studies of psilocybin, the hallucinogenic mushroom material, as well. One of them being this really promising integration with substance abuse treatment, where they would give people recovering from alcohol abuse psilocybin, and they would gain this introspection and experience of self-awareness, and they had a significantly higher rate of recovery and sustained recovery when the hallucinogenic mushrooms were part of their treatment plan.
Yeah.
And this is not being done in like a hippie hut somewhere. These research was being done at hospitals and some of the best universities. I mean, there are professors at Johns Hopkins Medical School that are very excited to be able to resume their research on psilocybin and LSD.
And I've often heard, though usually from the more hippie types, that there's no evidence really in both of those drugs that there's any significant long-term negative or even to some degree risk of overdose. I mean, like you could technically overdose on anything. You can, if you could syringe yourself in the nose with THC, you can overdose, but it would be very difficult, from what I understand, like given a bag full of mushrooms, to somehow eat enough of them that you're not just going to get food poisoning and throw up, rather than just like die from an overexposure to psilocybin.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's died from overdose, but you will go kind of nuts for a while. I've
Yeah, I mean, according to the Brown University health website, the student health website, which I feel like is, a nice middle ground maybe in terms of bias. Uh, the only risks that they post is dizziness, numbness of the tongue, lips, or mouth, shivering or sweating, nausea, and anxiety.
and possibly going on a trip to purgatory.
Yeah, and also don't drive. It says operating machinery while under the influence of reality altering substances is extremely dangerous. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah. There's a drug called ibogaine. It's a root. It's a psychedelic root that has been very effective in treating heroin addiction. Actually, is you basically go on this like 12 or 24 hour, I can't remember, super long trip, and it teaches you basically all the fucked up stuff that you did to people. It's like a Christmas Carol type of experience, I think, where like you just realize all the shit that you did wrong, and that's what is necessary for people to get off that stuff. Like, you can't get off of it until you really realize what you've been doing is fucked up, and you need to do the effort to get off of it. There's no amount of like forced rehab that's going to make you realize that. It's like something that you have to come to on your own, and that's what this thing, apparently, this route does for people. And there's like a way lower rate of relapse than like anything else, I think, as far as when I was researching about it, I remember. So it's super interesting because it's like the psychological shift that it brings about that's necessary. It's not just a chemistry thing. It's a psychological mind shift.
And I've heard with mushrooms that they can have good effects on people with depression, like chemical depression, and helping correct that, like long term. I don't know how well evidence that is. I don't have any research in front of me, so but I could swear I've heard that before. Peter, do you know any of the actual findings that they've come up with so far with either of these?
I I don't know about depression, but it's interesting that Sam brings up the ibogaine root, which I have not heard of either, but it checks out with the use of mushrooms in treating alcohol addiction.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
also, and I just sent Eli a picture of Paul Stamets, who tells this he's like this sort of self-taught mushroom expert, has this massively successful mushroom-centric business, has several fungus-related patents, including one that kills harmful ant colonies. Fascinating stuff. Paul Stamets' story is that he grew up with a terrible, debilitating stutter. He could barely get a word out without stuttering. He felt really isolated because of it, because he didn't want to talk to people. He was embarrassed. And he spent a lot of his time actually looking down because he didn't even want to make eye contact with people. So he felt pretty lonely. And at one point, he started out as a lumberjack. He got a hold of some hallucinogenic mushrooms. And, this being a long time ago, there's no internet or, psychedelics.com or something. He didn't know what the dose was. So he ate an entire mushroom, which is, for those of you at home, is apparently like 10 times or something what you're supposed to actually have. And the thunderstorm was coming. So he's a lumberjack. So he's like, oh, this is going to be a great storm. I'm going to climb to the top of this tree and watch the storm. And these huge clouds are rolling in, lightning striking. The wind picks up, and he starts clinging to this tree for dear life. And that's when his trip starts. And it's this intense experience of fear and introspection as the storm is raging, and then he starts to develop some meta awareness, like, okay, wait, I think my trip is starting. What should I think about? Yeah, what about stutter? Yeah, what about stuttering? Okay, Paul, you will stop stuttering now, and you're gonna stop stuttering now. And that, he says, that became his mantra. He's clinging to this tree. The storm is raging. He's seeing all sorts of geometric patterns. And by the end of the storm and the end of his trip, he goes back to his house, goes to bed, wakes up the next morning, sees this really attractive woman who he knew had some interest in him. And she said, "Oh, hey, Paul. Good morning." And he looks up at her and he says, "Good morning." And he never stuttered again.
So what you're saying is, to fix politics, we need to give Joe Biden mushrooms.
Probably.
No,
Give all of them mushrooms and let them sort it out.
well, because the story is that he has a stutter. That's a whole other. That's not. That's.
The man has the gift of gab.
Well, allegedly he had a stutter as a child, and he overcame that stutter. But then when he misspeaks now, particularly CNN always will run a story about, well, Joe Biden has a stutter, and it's like, well, the stutter he had as a child made him pause and then resume speaking, where the stutter he has now makes him say completely the wrong word constantly, or the entire wrong sentence. So just again, we can get into that another time. But anyway, that's they say it's not a good joke if you have to explain it. And so since we're explaining a joke, we'll get back to the topic. So
well, I think that's super fascinating. I had an experience where essentially, quick recap of my life. I was a very depressed, socially anxious person. I had a kind of like crappy childhood, and I was like very depressed. I found psychedelics in my like early 20s, late teens, I want to say. And what they did was they kind of just opened my eyes to like, essentially the nascent understanding that like, oh, this depressed, anxious mind state is not you. Like you are much this process of being. They open up the lid of limited being, and you kind of look around and you're like, wow, I am part of everything, kind of. It's very hard to describe unless you kind of experience it, but like for me personally, and then I went on to, a lot of people get stuck in that psychedelic mind state where they're like, oh, you have to have psychedelics to have a spiritual experience like that. And I don't think that at all. I mean, I went on to kind of develop meditation and like a spiritual practice and understanding that's doesn't have to do with psychedelics. And now I rarely, if ever, partake. But what it did for me is, I would say it deprogrammed a lot of the programming that I had, negative programming. As far as reprogramming for positive, I don't. I would say that's not what they're for. But a lot of people have different viewpoints about that. But they kind of just like return your state of innocence that you had as a kid. And you can actually see things not as you think they are, but as they actually are. And then also a bunch of like kind of crazy circus like mental fantasies, you know. But it kind of like can take away that like filter that you're seeing over everything. That's very difficult as you get older to remove, you know.
Yeah, so you're saying that psychedelics can help deprogram, they help some people reprogram, but for some of these experiences, you don't even need psychedelics.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's what psychedelics taught me was like there is another mind state than the one that you are currently living in all the time and that you're miserable with, you know. So
yeah,
to be shown that rather than just like think about that is a very, you know, thinking about that and experiencing that are two very different things. And so once you experience a different mind state than the one that you're habituated to, you're like, whoa, what else is there? You know, I mean, what this experience of life and living that I thought I kind of understood and that was kind of just negative and prosaic is actually this great dynamic, crazy, wonderful mystery. And now like let me explore more about what's going on here, you know? And then for me, I went into like, let me settle my mind, let me learn to concentrate, you know, meditate, shut off sensory input and all that, and then, you know, learn about what different spiritual teachers throughout history have been all saying and that kind of thing. But the beginning of that process was psychedelic for me because I had such programming from my childhood and like from who knows what. And I had to like smash through that, I think, in order to become like something else and realize there was something else to become, you know?
yeah, and this is a really cool moment because if we took the audio of what you just said over the last 3.5 minutes or so and replaced any mention of psychedelics with cognitive therapy, it would check out.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Which is really cool because we use a lot of the same metaphors in cognitive therapy that this sort of programming that you've been developing since you were a child becomes a lens through which you see the world and can make you really depressed or really anxious. And
Mhm.
you know, one of the first things you need to learn is that you are not your depression and that there's another way to live and to think. Um, and within kind of the new wave mindfulness based therapies, child mind is really
Yeah.
important because you know, they have roots in the mindfulness practice. This is, I mean, this is fascinating, and it shows that there's some legitimate benefit to these experiences that you described, Sam.
Oh, absolutely. I think that people are just a lot of people are stuck in, you know, experiences of trauma, or it doesn't even necessarily have to be a specific experience of trauma, or just it could just be like a way of seeing things that they're habituated to, and the mind makes connections. The more it reinforces those or thinks the same thoughts, the stronger those pathways get, right? So we get like stuck in these ruts. It's like riding in a circle on a muddy road. The wheels start like digging in, and then it's hard. You can't even get out of it. So you need to learn a way to get out of those ruts. And for me, psychedelics was like the beginning of that. Now, the process is much longer than that. And I think a lot of people with psychedelics get caught up in like, oh, this experience is like going on a carnival ride or going on a vacation, you know? And then you got to go back to like your normal life, your 9 to 5, which is, you know, your regular mind, your habituated mind. And then they're like, well, I need these like psychedelics. But it's like this quick thing that comes and goes, and it's supposed to teach you that there's another way, but you got to work kind of like every day, and you got to slog through it. You got to put in the work, and you know, a lot of people want kind of like Huxley called it gratuitous grace. I think, you know, they just want to like a pill. You know, it's like how people do their health, like medicine. They're like, I don't want to like fix my eating habits and exercise and mental habits. I just want a pill. You know,
and that's an old concept too, because that's in Brave New World.
Yeah,
they
for
have,
sure.
Selma or whatever it is.
That's me. I buy more vitamins and more mushroom powders instead of just fixing my diet.
I've been working on fixing my diet. I gotta have a talk with my cousin. I do a game night every Friday, and he's always like, "Oh, I'll bring some pop," and he brings like 10 things of pop, and I'm just like, I've been doing so good on my diet though. Like you're filling my fridge with temptation.
Dude, get a soda stream, and then you can make soda. I mean, I never drank soda really, but I got a soda stream, and you make like sparkling water, and then you can put different syrups in it. But you can get syrups that are like better than the sugary, those corn syrups.
I really like the Skittles sugar-free flavor things that you put in the water. I'm sure they have terrible chemicals in them, but you know they're not making me fat, and so.
Actually,
Well, I know there's a whole thing about artificial sweeteners and like about like hunger, but that doesn't seem to affect me. Like if I drink Diet Pop, I'm not like, well, now I'm hungry, so I might be lucky there. They gave me Ozempic, not for diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but it makes you not want to eat anything, and that seems to work really well.
okay. So
There you go.
is that good?
Hmm?
So is that good medicine or bad medicine?
Well, it seems to be working, and it's not something you would have to permanently take, and so I'd say that's good. I feel like there's a lot of the treatments that are just like permanent treatments, and those I get like skeptical about, like where it's like, I
Take this
mean,
forever.
yeah, where it's like you have like high blood pressure, just take this forever now. You have ADHD, just take this forever now. You have whatever,
Yeah.
and it's just like I don't know, man. Like I feel like maybe some of these are not as solvable, like ADHD, but like there are definitely things you can do to fix your blood pressure, where like it shouldn't be a forever solution.
Sure.
So, finances. If we're all good with the mushrooms for now.
Yeah.
I did manage to get a picture of the guy on the stream, so people can see that now. And so we're over here, and the mushroom guy is over here. What was his name again? Just for anyone who wants to look him up.
Paul Stamets.
And I'll probably repeat this at the end, but if there are any links and references, I'll stick them in the video description on YouTube. So maybe we'll get some articles down there. So.
Oh, I did want to say one thing. I like wouldn't recommend anybody like kind of go and like do a bunch of mushrooms unless you feel like you need it. Like you need like a different. I don't recommend that to people, but I do meet people sometimes, and I'm like, I think this is what this person needs, you know. But like it's public and stuff, so I wouldn't recommend that shit. Honestly, I recommend like to people like realize that spirituality is like a real thing, and you can actually like work on your consciousness and work on controlling your consciousness, because we feel we're so distracted. I mean, there's like a device in your pocket that has like all this content for infinite content essentially, and like we're constantly going from place to place and constantly distracted. TV shows and everything. It's like very bad actually for our mind, like super bad, and you got to balance that with like actually mastering like your free open consciousness without some loud things all up here, and that's really what it's about. And psychedelics just like started that for me, by showing me that there was something like that. But anyway.
So Well, I should have brought this up earlier. This has been on my mind since we changed topics. But the reason I started with this, with hello, adults, children, dreamers of all ages, is because there was leaked audio from Disney executives where they were talking about how they got rid of all gendered introductions at their parks and they replaced it with that. So instead of hello, like ladies, gentlemen, children of all ages, they replaced it with a non-gendered intro of. They gave a couple examples, and that's kind of an amalgamation of two of them. To be honest, that they didn't say that verbatim, but anyway.
Dreamers of all ages.
But that was
Great.
kind of like the hot news story of like the last 24 hours, and so that's why I introed us that way.
At the same time that how many Disney executives were busted in that child trafficking sting?
I don't know about that. I'm sure it happened though.
Yeah, there was a couple of Disney people who worked at Disney and that were caught in this like massive, like over 100 people were arrested in this like massive child trafficking ring.
That was was that like 7 years ago maybe now?
No, that was recent.
Oh, was it recent?
Yeah, it was like right around the time that they came out with that intro, changed their intro.
Well, that was just today. They were talking about that in an all hands on deck Zoom meeting that somebody leaked to the public.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was pretty recently, maybe a week or two ago. Don't quote me on that, but
I mean, we could have brought up the Jon Stewart thing too, because he was in the news the last 24 hours for misreading a teleprompter with like woke stuff about transgenderism, and so there's a bunch of people mad that he went quote unquote woke, and then other people mad that maybe it wasn't really him because he's reading a teleprompter. So like, who's putting him up to it? It's just, I didn't have enough time to look into that. That was also the last 24 hours. But with the finance stuff, there's so much interesting stuff going on. I don't know which one I want to get to. I guess I'll do the Joe Biden one, where he was talking about a unrealized gains tax. And so the way this tax would work is, let's say you bought $100 in stock, and all of a sudden the company goes really big with some new invention, and now your stock is worth $10 million. Well, normally you would get taxed when you sell it, and so you sell it and you receive that money and you would get taxed on it. Well, now Biden is saying that these sorts of gains, whether it's stock or real estate that you own or the company that you're part owner of, when they go up in value, you have to pay tax on the difference. So you would owe $2 million in tax if you bought $100 of some sort of stock and all of a sudden it became worth $10 million.
Joe Biden can go fuck right off with that.
Basically, I think what's going to happen is that it's going to get in front of a judge or a lawyer somewhere, and they're just going to be like, "That's not how money works."
Yeah, you didn't sell it. Like what? So basically, what? Every time it goes up, you're liable for that, even if you don't sell it, and then it goes back down, and like, oh, yeah, you still owe that money because it went up at one point.
Yeah, that's a good question.
How much shit I ever heard in my life?
Like, do you get to write off like unrealized losses?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like how my Robinhood portfolio is in the trash right now. And I could have put that on my taxes instead of getting taxed on the 7 cents of foreign dividends I earned.
Well, this would only affect people making over $100 million, which is why it's called a billionaire tax for some reason.
Well, it sounds better than 100 millionaire tax.
Well, what's interesting is that it led me down this bizarre rabbit hole of like trying to figure out like how much money there is, right? I'm thinking of like all the people trying to say we should redistribute whatever, right? And so I start Googling it and I'm quickly confronted with the idea that it's not that simple, apparently. And so like if you look at the total amount of dollars the US has printed, there's only like 2 trillion, right? And then if you look at like all sort of printed currency, there's like 6 trillion, but then not all currency is counted in that number. And so they say, well, really, if you count like the money in like every bank account in the world, there's like $40 trillion that exist. But then if you take into consideration like all vessels of wealth, you could get that number, like cryptocurrency, like long-term investments, everything. That number sort of like on the high end maxes out at 1 quadrillion. And so you have this range where there's either $2 trillion if you just count US physical money, all the way up to $1 quadrillion on the planet. And so the reason why I was looking into this is, even if you take that high quadrillion number, right? And you say, all right, we're just going to take all of the money and redistribute it evenly to everyone on Earth. Then everyone only gets $164,000.
Huh.
So then you'd have to figure out, like, how often are we going to do this?
Well, and also you got to think about, you're completely decimating literally all private property rights, all of everything in that process. I mean, there would be nothing. That's like an atom bomb to the entire world.
Especially in the quadrillion number, because that counts like cryptocurrency and like private property investments. And so like those things don't exist without transferring them to somebody. So you can't actually like get to $4 trillion. Because like if you trade Bitcoin for dollars to put into this redistribution program, someone is still holding Bitcoin, right? So you'd actually have to just like dissolve Bitcoin and then print that money. And that works for Bitcoin, but that doesn't work for like 200 acres of land the US government holds out in Nevada. Like you can't just like rip it off the surface of the earth and convert it into money. Like it's still land that's there. And so like if you were realistically, so you can't really use that 1 quadrillion number. It's not a real number. And so but so even under the most charitable redistribution like criteria, it's like $164,000 isn't really, like, it sounds like a lot of money, like if you were making that much every year, but in the terms of like that's like what each person's representative in the world economy is, it's not that much. And so
but it's very interesting what would happen after that, and after we completely decimated the world's business and everything. What would happen? It's like a game of Monopoly. Everybody starts with $2,000, right? What happens? Some people get lucky. Some people are more skillful. Some people are better at business, right? So that money, that would just start the process over again then, you know? And then what would eventually happen is certain people would have more and certain people would have less, you know? There's no way to keep it at even at all, because people are not even.
Yeah,
you know?
And the reason why I bring it up, because it's like, how does this relate to like Joe Biden's tax plan? Well, essentially, if you're trying to tax unrealized gains on like properties / investments that people are currently holding, you're essentially trying to redistribute that value, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. I mean, talk about disincentivizing investment.
Yeah, no kidding.
Plus, the gain is unrealized. I feel like the title of the tax itself says it all.
Well, the title of the tax is the billionaire's tax, but then he was talking about unrealized gains being taxable or should be taxable.
Oh, well, I mean, what did we talk about last week? They were calling that bill the Don't Say Gay bill. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that.
The Save
Still
Puppies
didn't
in...
like the bill. Still not happy it passed the way it did. But, I mean, to tax unrealized gains, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the Save the Puppies and Kittens bill that somehow gives like $100 million to Raytheon for heat-seeking missiles.
Just like every bill ever.
Marketing.
Why do we still give Raytheon and Boeing money? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, Boeing might need bailed out after their latest airplane is still being a catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think redistributive schemes are more. They're more of a fantasy than a reality, in that like they're based on kind of a lot of times people being like, well, it's less concerned for the poor and more like, hey, this guy's got more money than me, so I'm envious and like angry, you know, in my experience.
Yeah.
Where it's,
I pointed out to some of my friends, it's like, I don't want my kids to live under whatever tyranny you vote into power because you didn't get to drive a Ferrari in your lifetime.
That's precisely exact. You know, it's not like you're gonna fuck everything up for everyone because you can't deal with like the fact that you don't have everything you want because you're looking at what other people have. Like, yo, just be happy what you have, man. And there's of course like I'm not saying there shouldn't be social safety nets and stuff, but that's a different issue because these people are like, we need to destroy these people with a lot of money and take the money and redistribute it. That's their kind of like message. It's like the proletariat revolution.
I think the reason they think. Oh, sorry. Go on, Peter.
Yeah, I'd like to pose a question. I'm more or less with you guys. Redistribution, not really effective. So, I mean, we all identify as libertarians. What is the answer? I mean, you have, say, in the hypothetical scenario, which is pretty similar to reality, I mean, you have a group of people who are extraordinarily wealthy, and you have a group of people who are extraordinarily poor, living in the same country and the same economy. What do you do?
Well, one thing is just to get the last idea off my head, and it will help me answer that, is that I think the reason a lot of people think redistribution works is because they look at like the wealth in America and then just consider like redistributing that wealth in America, and then you can arrive at a much higher number than my 164,000, right? But like that doesn't say anything to the rest of the world, which they say is a concern to them. They're worried about like Indonesia and 17 countries in the Oceania you've never heard of before and all that. And so what does work? Well, one of the things you could look at is what is like the stagnation of inequality, where did that begin at, and where did the people who have these billions of dollars get them from to begin with? And almost every time the answer to that question goes back to the government, right? Like Google has the empire that it does because the internet is the infrastructure of the internet. It had been subsidized by the government, handing Google millions of dollars to allow them to host things on their services, to allow them to expand service in various areas, and basically granted them this monopoly. And like you see the same thing with Amazon. They want to build a warehouse, and you have states bidding to cut taxes and waive environmental regulations for them to have their super warehouse. And there's some arguments of why that might be a good idea because like a giant Walmart super or Amazon super warehouse is so big that it doesn't fit into the environmental code, so you have to make an exception for it to exist at all, which is another problem. But once the Amazon super warehouse exists, like they're not going to give that tax cut to somebody else. They're not going to let someone who could potentially compete with Amazon come in and tread on Amazon's ground. And so a lot of times you find that the root cause of this goes back to the government in the first place, like with the getting rid of the gold standard and changing everything with the Fed, and then having the government come in and basically say that student loans can't be defaulted on. And you see this like stagnation in wages and the transfer of money from the government to businesses. Because when you give money to the government, when they talk about, oh, billionaires need to pay their fair share. Well, billionaires giving the government money doesn't help you unless there's a government program that helps you. And so it's like vindictive in a way for people to be like, yes, we need the tax the billionaires because why? Like, it's not like there's a transfer of wealth from the billionaires to you. It's a transfer of wealth from billionaires to the government. And who gives the billionaires all the money? The government does. When they print money like they did in the last 2 years, it doesn't get printed and then distributed to everyone in stimulus checks, even though people did get some stimulus money. It's like a drop in the bucket compared to the money that goes into securities that they buy from banks and super corporations.
So, what I'm hearing is redistribution of wealth. Sounds great on a YouTube video. I mean, I'd love to get a $160,000 check from Jeff Bezos in the mail, sure. And for my neighbor to get one too. Yeah, for sure. Is that going to happen? No. Is that theft? Yes. So instead of that, tax the wealthy, tax everyone, have them pay their fair share. So tax people, and then instead of letting the government make questionable investments with that tax money, the government creates programs for people to get out of of their economic situation and improve their economic situation, whether that's low interest loans or trade schools or free daycare. I mean, is that tracking with you guys? Is that what I'm hearing?
Or maybe cut the government out of this whole thing, make them let us keep the money that we earned, and then we can set up these things ourselves. Because I just don't trust that the government, basically, I think it's proven at this point that the government does not have the concern of the common man on the top of their list. You know, despite what they say, it's all about deals, insider deals. And I mean, all the things Eli was saying, you know, so the problem isn't with the fact that we didn't tax enough. The problem is the root of the distributive and coercive power is not working to do the things that it is saying that it is doing and the things that it should be doing, which is working for the common man. It's just not happening, you know? So the problem, no amount of money is going to change that because the whole root of the tree is totally rotten, you know?
I think the answer isn't very simple. I think what you need to do is a combination of things. Is one, don't give some giant mega corporation with an unlimited scope millions, if not billions of dollars to do something that the government wants to do. If the government, and this isn't necessarily a very libertarian take, but if the government wants to expand like internet infrastructure, like under like for its own purposes, it shouldn't do so under the guise of another corporation, because you don't know what the corporation, it doesn't have limits on it to what it can do, and usually what it can do is, the answer is almost always something anti-competitive where it uses that money to demolish a bunch of competition, right? Which is not good for the market. The other thing is that if you stop favoring corporations in this way and you go back to making it easier for people to make their own businesses and to have their own corner of the market, and you end up having the government fall back into what is a more appropriate role in making sure that like consumers aren't abused by these companies, then you get a place where you introduce more mobility within the market, and that would be good. It doesn't solve everything, but I think that would be better. And of course, getting rid of the debt that the government has would be something I'd rather put money towards rather than redistributing it, because people end up relying on money that they end up getting redistributed to them through these programs. And so I would say it would be a long road, and the thing is like, I'm not a pure anarchist. I view the government in the minarchist way, where you essentially you make the government smaller until you break something, and then you reluctantly put it back, whatever it is that you broke. And markets don't respond well to big giant overhauls anyway. Like, you wouldn't want to just, if you had the power and you could just like bang the gavel and abolish the Fed, like, you would have global economic collapse. You have to phase it out. And so it's a very difficult, you have to basically get into the culture and get people to understand money and understand the problem first, so that they continue to support the policies that ultimately lead to better financial stability for individuals. And that's a long time, and there's a lot of steps to unraveling the sort of ball of yarn that we've created for ourselves.
Well, it might just unravel itself. Well, actually, they're doing it, but they're destroying the system that we have to set up a new system. That's part of like the Great Reset and stuff. Yeah. But yeah, they're trying to do a central bank digital currency where basically your entire purchasing history will be totally permanently, they'll be aware of everything you're buying, and they'll be able to program the money such that it can expire in a certain time if you don't spend it. Because right now they accomplish that through monetary policy, where setting interest rates real low and stuff. But they can just they're going to be directly able to program the money in your bank account, like, this will expire in a month if you don't spend it, so you better spend it, basically. Or that they're going to be able to oh, we don't like what you posted on social media, so your money disappears tomorrow. This is what they're aiming for, and they're starting it in China, and there's pilot programs all over the place and stuff. But this is their end game. So that's what they're basically collapsing the dollar so that they can implement this new system. So that's like total control. I mean, this is to the max of what they've already been doing with the Fed, but this is like the ultimate total, like, no way out, at that point. Complete control over, and they'll control people's behavior by controlling their monetary.
I mean, we can certainly see where that's happened, right? And some of the people, like the Schwab types, have talked about this in friendlier terms, but the end result of what they're saying comes to the same end. But
Yeah.
like, one of the things I think is, like, when you look at like fractional banking, so when you put your money in the bank is allowed to loan out a certain amount of your money, and that amount is 90%. And so basically, for every dollar that's printed, 10 times that is created, because when banks loan each other money and loan people money, they basically do it through a computer, not through handing them physical cash. And then when you will go to withdraw your money, they'll give you someone else's money if you tried to withdraw all of your money, and some of it's loaned out. And so the amount of money that gets multiplied whenever they print it is somewhere between 0 and 10 times. And an article I was reading says that the real number likes to sit around like 3.5, and then control over that number by incentivizing or disincentivizing loaning is what the what the Fed's job is. Which is, but then that changed during the Great Recession, where they added these other tools like being able to do quantitative easing and all that. And I'm still diving into all these sorts of things, but and that's where, like I say, it's really hard to just say there's a solution. I don't know that there is, but when you see countries like Russia being like, we're going back, and it makes sense from a strategic standpoint for Russia right now to go to a gold standard, because it keeps their inflation or deflation from moving, right? And the US could do the same thing. It could just snap its fingers and say, well, right now, this second, this much dollars buys you this much gold. And so like you can do that. There are long-term effects of it, and they can cause bank runs and things, which are obviously bad. That's what happened in the 1920s. But certain big changes are possible, but getting the whole thing to benefit people rather than corporations and the government basically scratching each other's back is, I think, a very long road. And I don't know that any one person is enough of an expert to be like, I have the total idea of how this should all work. I mean, that's the problem with like communism, where everyone thinks that if they just did it their way, they could fix it.
Communism's never been tried. Love that argument.
I always come back with the joke that, well, real capitalism has never been tried either.
Yeah.
Maybe that's probably true.
Another joke I like to tell, and this is all me. It was from earlier when we were talking about the trans thing. And I say this to my progressive friends. I was like, someday we're all going to be sitting in nursing homes being called far-right Nazis because we say things like trans rights or human rights, because our kids will remind us that human is a social construct.
Well, that's a great place to wrap up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if we had any references or anything. Oh, sorry, Sam. Say that again.
I said wrapping up is a social construct, Peter.
Oh yeah. Well, if we add any links or anything, they'll be down below. To any, if we decide to go dig up some sources, maybe we'll get challenged on some of this, because this is a very off the cuff discussion today.
I like off the cuff. I also like responding to challenges too,
Yeah, so if anyone wants to call us out in the comments, we'll see if we can respond to it. That might be something interesting we can do going forward.
Yes.
Nail.
All right. Well, see you guys next week.
All right. Have a good one, guys.
See you next week.